Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy, with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome into the Hoon. It's Bernard Hickey. I'm all on my own today because Peter Bale is travelling. He's somewhere in New York, and I hope it's not an ice facility. So we're going to talk this week with a bunch of people about the big news stories of the week. In 5 minutes or so, we're going to talk to Hoon Burt, who is the CEO of Electric Kiwi, one of the independent electricity retailers who've been very interested, along with every consumer. Remember, we're all users of electricity in our businesses and our firms, and we're doing it right now, using electricity to watch this live stream. This week, the government, after much huffing and puffing, announced reforms designed to A, get us through a dry winter, and B, improve competition in the market so that we can have electricity prices that don't increase 20% in 2 years, and deindustrialise a large chunk of our economy. As it turned out, it was a bit of a damp squib, and we'll talk about that today, not just with her, but also with our regular guest and climate expert, Catherine Dyer, who will join us from Wellington, where she is teaching at Victoria University. And then at 5:20, we'll have our regular geopolitical expert guest, Robert Patman from Otago University, join us to talk about that a moment last Saturday when Winston Peters announced that we weren't going to recognise Palestine, which really has shaken a few people, surprised a few people, and we'll talk a bit about what went on behind that, what it means for us. More action around Gaza this week, with plenty of news on not just the horrible events going on there, the killings of residents and the ongoing invasion of Gaza by Israel, but what's happening there with plans to so-called rebuild Gaza. Tony Blair is involved. And we'll no doubt talk too about some of the issues around the geopolitical contests at the moment and where New Zealand fits into those, along with some extraordinary set pieces. If any of you saw any of that rambling speech from Donald Trump, let alone the ranting speech from his Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, to their generals, who were remarkably quiet, that was a thing as well this week. And of course, plenty of news on the political and geopolitical fronts elsewhere, which we'll talk about at 5:40 or so with Daniel McLaughlin, who is the columnist on politics for The Listener. He writes very, very thoughtfully about not just the practice of politics, but the theory of it, and how New Zealand's issues with being a captured democracy fit in, not just in the sweep of history here, but overseas as well. It happens everywhere. And this week was a perfect example of how entrenched interests managed to game the system, our version of democracy, to ensure not much changed and they could continue to reap monopoly profits from assets which used to be publicly owned in full and now are captured in many ways. The government is captured by our electricity system, and the electricity system is captured by the system players itself. Catherine, lovely to see you. We're going to be joined in a moment by Hoon Burt, the CEO of Electric Kiwi, which is great because we'll have a chance to talk to someone on the ground. But while she'll be joining us shortly. But firstly, what did you think of this week's announcements of these so-called electricity reforms?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, one of the things that's come up even before these announcements were made were the fact that climate change was completely absent from the terms of reference for that modelling work that was done by Frontier Economics, which kind of weights things in favour of fossil fuels anyway. If you don't have any concern about your emissions levels and what you're trying to achieve down the line, then yeah, you're more likely to bring in fossil fuels than you would be otherwise.
Yes, and that's what they're planning to do, to look at building an LNG terminal. And it was interesting, Frontier said, well, let's take electricity out of the emissions trading scheme, which again seems like a bizarre thing to do. I'd like to welcome into the Hoon now Huya Burt, who is the CEO of Electric Kiwi. Huya, great to see you on the Hoon.
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
And I wanted to introduce you to Catherine Dyer, who is our climate and now electricity expert as well. It's pretty hard not to be involved in climate coverage without thinking about electricity. We were just talking about the LNG terminal. Catherine, can you talk a bit more about some of the other things that are being done and whether they'll make a difference, you think?
Well, yeah, I guess the question marks that I have most strongly are about the things that were done in the modelling exercise in terms of risk weighting, for instance. So first of all, there's the decarbonisation issue, but there's also question marks about the effect of peak oil. You know, we've already had conventional oil has peaked already, most probably in the early 2000s, or 2010ish, and most of the predictions or forecasts for when all liquids, which includes natural gas, will peak, is within the 25-year time frame for building things like the LNG terminal that they were talking about. And so you're creating a path dependency there, which could, result in increased prices down the line. So it's this, there's a really short-term focus instead of thinking, longer term about where we need to go and what some of the issues might be. I've got questions about whether they thought about the distributional impacts of the plans that they had. So what are the impacts for households versus businesses? And even within the groups of households, what are the impacts across different types of households? There didn't seem to be any consideration of looking at things like using demand smoothing to shape demand for electricity and therefore change what the requirements are. There was no talk about, should we be constraining growth and demand in some places in order to create room in other places? There was no talk of sending Methanex packing. Didn't seem to come up as an option.
Or the TY point smelter.
Yep, right. And there was also no consideration of things like the resilience benefits from distributed renewable energy. So what happens, and this is where climate change comes into it again, if you're looking at a future of compounding and cascading risks associated with tipping points and with extreme weather events, what are the risks in terms of resiliency? So to massive countrywide infrastructure, as opposed to having more localized renewable or community energy infrastructure. So the whole exercise just seems to be not just the government's response to the work or the recommendations that come from Frontier, but also the work that they did in terms of where they generated their recommendations from.
Huya, it was a big swathe of documents. We had Frontier's main report, which has been sitting with the minister for upwards of 5 months. Then we had a bunch of peer reviews from all sorts of people. And then the government's response to the report, which essentially meant that 8 out of 10 of the Frontier recommendations were ignored. What did you think, firstly, of that Frontier report?
Yeah, I think I was actually pleasantly surprised at the fact that they had considered something more bold than I was expecting. And given the short time frame to turn it around, and then the extremely long time frame that it sat on desks being debated, there's definitely a lot in there which would have been quite transformative with a bit more detailed thinking. I think the biggest thing for us is just Frontier really acknowledged that that market failure they acknowledge some of the hard truths in this market about the incentives that the gentailers have to bring new investment to market, and also acknowledging that by waiting to make change, you really only make things worse for yourself down the track. And anyone will who's ever built infrastructure will probably be able to give that salient lesson. So in terms of some of the recommendations that they made, particularly around having a mechanism for firming to be built and be really expanding on that thermal co idea to take us through the transition, it could definitely, when deployed right, I felt like the peer reviewers kind of came in and said, look, it's just, it's subject to, market distortion, and that they were really very much in favor of the status quo, whereas Frontier had this idea like, hey, actually, let's acknowledge that the status quo is what's got us here. So, let's try and do something different.
So just to remind our audience, Frontier suggested that the government sell off its 51% stakes in the three gentailers into the market and use the money to build and buy, effectively take over a so-called newco, which would be responsible for ensuring we have a base of electricity that can be generated in the event of a dry winter. But the government said no to that. They're not interested in selling those stakes. And one of the other things Frontier said, which the government seemed to respond to, was that the gentailers, which are the three gentailers that are 51% owned by the government, that's Mercury, Meridian and Genesis, were somehow feeling constrained from investing because they hadn't been given permission by their main shareholder to invest, which, when you look at the statements of expectation for these three state-controlled companies, the fact that the chair and the board effectively are appointed mostly by the state, and that the state keeps getting these dividends and knows that they're getting the dividends because there's no investment. The suggestion that, if only the government had said, we'd love you to invest more, which of course they have regularly told them, well, at least told them in public. You do wonder what's being said behind the scenes by Treasury about, well, if you do ask them to invest, that means the dividends will be lower. But what did you think about this idea? We'll write them a letter saying, yes, we do want you to invest, and we'll top up any equity that you need.
That question for me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
So,
yep.
It seems, quite frankly, just it doesn't seem plausible that there haven't been any conversations between the major shareholder and the board about investment in firming capacity. And I guess there's an opportunity to go and find out what's been really said, but we have known of declining gas supply for some time in this country, and the decline is absolutely not a surprise. What's been the decline has been faster than expected. That's what has really changed in the last few years. And so, and when you look at the level of dividend, particularly prior to the last couple of years versus investment, then it just doesn't all stack up. And it's kind of the unspoken truth that any investment that a gentailer makes, it will, because of the market power they have, it will create the conditions for prices to come down, and that's not actually really in the interest. So it is in the interest just to keep the market slightly undersupplied. That's where, when you have market power, you make the best commercial returns. So they're just doing what's in the interest of their shareholders. If their shareholders want them to do something differently, then they obviously need to have that conversation.
Catherine, what did you think of the what I thought was the missing link in a big chunk of this report, which is a really big discussion about using a burst of renewables investment instead of this focus on an LNG terminal and creating a sort of a newco.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. That they almost started out by saying we're not interested in renewables, we're interested in fossil fuels. So just give us something that meet that. Again, there's the opportunity to create some space around gas by losing Methanex from the mix, basically. And then that gives you the space to build out renewables. And the assumption that what you need is base power is also one that's been questioned a little bit in terms of, there are multiple ways that you can deal with meeting energy demands in the future. And that is, that's not necessarily the only solution. Is not necessarily to build more base power, and particularly more thermal base power. There's all sorts of ways you can go about that. I mean, you can turn our existing hydro lakes into battery storage and build up all of your renewables to, supply a much higher level on a day-to-day basis, and then they do the backup for dry years. So there's, it's just that question of how widely do we consider the potential around this, and then, did we look at the existing way the market is set up and then think about what sort of incremental changes we can make in order to make it function better? Or did we look at what kind of situation do we want to wind up with in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then how do we shape the market to meet that?
Yeah, because by starting at the beginning, and I hadn't realized this, starting by specifically saying you cannot consider the climate effects or, our position in the Paris agreements in your consideration of this issue just seems bonkers. But Huia, what do you think is likely to happen now in the electricity market? Because there's other things happening. The Electricity Authority is, doing some things. We still don't know exactly how a new system that would mean that we all start to see the wholesale prices internally that the gentailers have, and that they're supposed to offer those same prices to everyone. How do you think the competitive market as it is will react to this, and what might happen from here?
Well, certainly we've seen, if you take the futures market, there's been no material change. So effectively the market is saying, hey, no change here. Prices are going to remain really high for the next 3 to 4 years. And that's going to really, really impact households and businesses, because those prices will be built into their bills next year and the year on and the year on. It's just because you're purchasing that energy in advance. We can't sit there and wait for prices to drop at some point. It's not prudent to do so. So that's going to be locked in, and that's really, really worrying for households. Consumer New Zealand have seen that the level of issues that people have with bills this winter in particular has been the greatest that they've ever seen. Businesses, again, we've been working a lot with the Auckland Business Chamber. They've already seen prices increase by 30%, 40%, and that's not going away. So in terms of the end consumer, that is really concerning. So what we believe is that what you need to bring prices down, you need more supply, right? And to bring in more supply, you need parties who are incentivized to bring that in at the lowest cost. And that's where this competition reform becomes so important, because these level playing field measures that the Electricity Authority are working on and are consulting on, that's really the only concession to competition that was talked about in the package. And it was one of those, ongoing pieces rather than anything new. And what that means is that, implemented well, with a large number of safeguards around it, in a rules-based manner, not in a principles-based manner, with monitoring and enforcement, that should with the right calculations, putting a lot of qualifiers on it here, that should mean that yes, those parties have to offer, in particular that firming contracts on the same terms to all independent parties, both independent generators and retailers, and that could allow more independent generators to come into the market, supported by independent retailers like ourselves with PPAs, and start to actually, bring more supply on that will over time bring prices down. But yeah, it absolutely becomes quite critical because competition is at the foundation of markets.
Just
It does
final.
seem crazy. Sorry,
You
Bernard.
go,
It
Catherine.
does seem crazy to me that the only substantial market reform that they seem to look at or recommend was the government selling its shares in the gentailers, when there are all sorts of market reforms that the government can make that don't require that, but would still have the kind of effects that you're looking for in terms of major market reforms. So I just, it feels like some of that stuff was absent from the the report.
And if I can just say one more thing, I think, what this package relies on is the status quo. That is for large companies who are effectively, we're putting out the fate of our country's economy, our households, everyone in their hands, and saying, you guys sort it out, we'll, build this LNG terminal, but you'll still need to produce the electricity. If we really want to have an affordable, abundant energy future, we need 10, 20 companies this size. Small players, big players. It's just, it can't be that closed, and that's really disappointing.
Thank you very much, Huey, for coming on to the show to talk about this. Lovely to see you, and thank you, Catherine, too, for coming on for a good old chat about electricity, which is my idea of a fun time. And of course, you pointed out rightly that to exclude the climate effects or to just focus only on LNG just shows that frankly, they weren't serious about it in the long run. Catherine Dyer, thank you very much for coming onto the show. Well, now it's time thank you, Kiwi. Now it's time to welcome Robert Patman. Robert, it's great to see you there dialing in from the University of Otago. It's just me and this week because Peter is en route from Europe through the United States, and right. I have to hope he's not in an ice facility somewhere.
I was going to say, if they're looking at Peter into the United States, let's hope they release him as well.
Yeah. Let's hope they haven't been reading his Twitter feed. Robert, it's been quite a week in New Zealand and geopolitics. What did you think when you were watching? I assume you were watching that Saturday morning speech from Winston Peters to the UN General Assembly.
I thought it was a bit of a serious mismatch between the gravity of the situation in Gaza and indeed the West Bank and the response of the government. And it was a sort of wait and see response. And it seemed to me that it was given that New Zealand had consistently argued for a two-state solution and consistently recognized the Palestinian right to political self-determination, I thought it could quite easily take that symbolic step, given the gravity of the situation and given the example of some other traditional allies like Australia, Britain, Canada, which decided that Mr. Netanyahu's agenda, which apparently includes annexing the West Bank and taking full control of Gaza, or at least before the Trump peace plan, necessitated a rapid response of Palestinian state recognition to preempt that possibility, rather than waiting until state recognition would be irrelevant because there'd be no territory in which to establish a state. I felt I didn't understand the logic of the decision as articulated. There were several things that really puzzled me. Firstly, the implication that the time was not right is that it would be better sometime in the future.
That's right. And what could possibly be different other than the rubble would be even deeper and higher?
Well, let's think about the plight of Gaza without state recognition. It's been reduced to rubble. 90% of the buildings have been destroyed, including residential buildings, hospitals and schools. And 90% of the population has been displaced and continue to be displaced. And a military campaign continues to go on there. So, if anything, the situation is less promising as it unfolds. And so I was puzzled about that. I was also puzzled about the fact that while the government put great emphasis on what it called the de facto government of Hamas, and also the lack of a ceasefire, at one level, both those points make some sense, but we shouldn't overstate the role of Hamas. It's a Islamist militant organization which has been effectively in control of Gaza since 2006, 2007. But it was powerless to prevent the IDF doing what they wanted in Gaza. So I was puzzled. And
why didn't we just join up with Canada, the UK, and Australia? Three of the Five Eyes partners that we have, our major trading partners, apart from China and the US. I don't get it. Why didn't we join with the club?
It's puzzling. I don't know whether the foreign minister, with his network of US contacts, had some inkling into the Trump plan that emerged. But that in itself would not be a reason to delay.
Yeah.
It might even add impetus to a Trump plan.
Has this damaged our standing as a sort of a middle power, a principled middle power? Or not middle power, but, a small power that punches above its weight, we like to think.
I think it's damaged our self-image and our reputation externally, and the two things are a little bit separate. They're slightly different. I think many Kiwis quite rightly saw this country, based on its track record, embracing non-nuclear security, being a vocal opponent of apartheid, resisting an illegal US invasion of Iraq, as being a small country that didn't fudge tough decisions when fundamental moral and legal values were involved. And I think that self-image has been damaged. And the reason I say that, and it's purely unscientific, I was struck by the number of Kiwis, both in the social media and in sort of public spaces, that said they felt quite ashamed that we hadn't taken a stand and made our position very clear and sent a message to Mr. Netanyahu in the most clear terms, that a situation in which the UN says is genocidal, we have not expressed our opposition to that. And the reason it would express opposition by recognizing a Palestinian state is because Mr. Netanyahu, and he said this after the Trump plan, does not, he said there will not be a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
So by recognizing a Palestinian state, you're doing something, you're sending a very clear message to Mr. Netanyahu. Yeah. But we decided not to do that.
Yeah. That peace plan, though, what did you think of the peace plan which has emerged, in which my understanding is a Tony Blair and Donald Trump-led organisation would run Gaza?
Well, Mr. Blair's certainly got an interesting track record. As Prime Minister, he joined with the United States in an illegal invasion of Iraq.
And his own people,
let alone Iraqis.
Yeah, and his own people haven't forgiven him, let alone
no. That's and even his own party. The Trump plan does actually have some welcome aspects. It's quite clear that Mr. Trump's moved away from his ambition to, or stated possible ambition to evict all Palestinians from Gaza. He's now saying all the Palestinians can stay, and those outside the territory can come back. He's also talked about rebuilding, and he's also talking about a phased Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. At least that's technically there. If you look at the 20 points, and so in a sense, the Trump administration has shifted its ground. I think the key thing in stimulating this was the Israeli attack on Qatar in mid-September, or whenever it was. I think it may be early September, when Netanyahu attacked Qatar. That triggered a very strong response from the Qataris, who lost one of their security personnel, but also from the Saudis and from the Egyptians. And the interesting thing is, although this Trump peace plan is very much it's very much what I call a Trump Netanyahu plan. Netanyahu has had to see some of his red lines crossed. The thing is, it's all very well coming up with a plan, but will Mr. Netanyahu understand the plan in the same way and implement it? After all, Netanyahu unilaterally withdrew from Trump's ceasefire proposal in March.
He's just doing whatever he thinks is
and so
he wants to do.
He thinks he's got Trump's measure, and he may think, well, if I have to publicly please the president, I'll do it, and keep the show on the road. It has significant implications, of course, for his coalition, because this plan seems to rule out any possibility of the Israeli annexation or full control of Gaza. And there were already elements in his coalition government who were making plans for settlement there. So it could be a few convulsions, but I think Mr. Netanyahu probably feels it's consistent with his war plans. That's what he says, his war aims. And of course, all this will come to nothing, Bernard, if Hamas do not accept the ultimatum that they've been given, which is to basically surrender
and just dissolve themselves.
Yeah, and they're given, they can disappear into the sunset in relative safety if they give up their weapons and go. They're under a lot of pressure. This is the interesting thing, is that many Arab countries and Muslim countries have been quick to embrace Trump's plan, including those who want a two-state solution, which in itself is a little bit puzzling. But it may be because many of these countries are close to the United States, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and they may believe that by backing Trump's plan, Trump will have some commitment to seeing it through. And since it theoretically crosses some of Netanyahu's red lines, they may believe this is a way of driving a wedge between Netanyahu and Trump. I'm a bit skeptical on that front, but it's interesting that this has happened. But suffice it to say, because so many countries, including our own, has backed it, I think that puts, particularly in the Arab world, I mean, Turkey, which has been quite supportive of Hamas in some ways, and Qatar, who acted as a mediator, and before the events of the 7th of October, were given the responsibility by the Israeli government for funneling aid there. Well, not giving the responsibility, but they encouraged Qatar to support Hamas.
Just thinking now about what's going on in the United States with Donald Trump and his relationship with his own military. We saw, I still think, an extraordinary event this week when all of the United States' generals and admirals and Air Force commanders and everyone, they all had their uniforms on, dress uniforms with all of the badges and
very expensive as well.
Yeah, all flew in for a pep talk by the new Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and Trump. What did you think of those two speeches, and what do you think it says about the world's greatest military power?
I'm not sure much of the military audience, if you looked at them as they were listening to Trump and Hegseth, I'm not sure they were impressed. Remember, although sometimes people caricature the military and simplistic terms, these are often very skilled professional people who have spent many years fine-tuning their profession, and many of them see their commitment to the Constitution in the U.S. state, in the context of the U.S. Political system. So I don't know. I mean, I found it kind of ironic that, Hegseth, he has some military experience, but not particularly distinguished in military terms, was telling this assembled hierarchy of, the top brass, how they should do this and that. It all sounded rather performative to me. And it also sounded like trying to roll the clock back. It was Back to the Future. And I'm not sure how successful it was. And Mr. Trump's speech was probably even less fluent than Hegseth's.
Yeah, there's been some discussion. I mean, the bar is low, but there's been some discussion about his health, his acuity, and just the rambly-shambly nature is a thing, but this was exceptionally rambly-shambly.
It was, but his performance in the UN was as well. And so I don't think that worries Mr. Trump or maybe some of his supporters, although it's interesting to see that splits are beginning to deepen within the MAGA movement, with Marjorie
Taylor Greene. Yep.
Taylor Greene. I always get the names in the wrong order, but she's become quite a defiant figure. And the Epstein files do seem to be the big dividing line, amongst other things. So, it's interesting. And I mean, I'm not. I don't know. It's superficial to watch a speech and then say you understand the audience, because I'm not going to make that claim. I just got the intuitive sense watching many of those people. They thought all this could have been done by Zoom, and there's a lot of money at a time of belt tightening in the United States being spent to listen to the less than stellar speakers who didn't have a lot of substance there. It was sort of like a anti-woke rants. And I'm not sure how much, how well it will go down, but we'll see.
Yes.
I'm not quite boosted military morale, put it that way.
No, you could sense in their faces the response. This could have been an email. And what I found interesting is because Trump is very aware of, whether the crowd seem to like him or respond to him, that he made some comments in the speech about, it all seems very quiet out there. You're willing to, you're within your rights not to applaud or even leave. But of course, if you do, that's going to hurt your career, which was
it's a classic sort of, mob boss extortionist sort of line, isn't it?
It's weird. And the other thing I'm curious about, from the point of view of soft power, if there is such a thing these days, the United States has had a lot of it for good reasons over the last 80 years or so. But we're just at another one of these moments of government shutdown. We have, Trump talking about war zones in cities, and then talking to the governor of the city, and the governor saying, actually, no, it's not a war zone. Would you like to come and visit our farmers market? And it turned, what was interesting about that, Trump actually came out and said, gee, the governor seems quite happy. It's almost as if what I'm seeing on the TV is not in line with reality. He actually said that out loud. And yes, you're quite right, Mr. Trump, because he's just watching some pieces on Fox, some of which included 5-year-old footage of, riots post the George Floyd, I think, marches. So there's some weird stuff going on. Do you think the United States is soft power, and it still wants allies and a coalition to stand up against particularly China? You could argue Russia. Do you think that soft power is waning?
On the whole, I do. But there will be, there's two aspects to this. I think America's standing in the world, particularly amongst other liberal democracies, has generally gone down. First of all, America seems to be on the path to some sort of authoritarian state That's, the view within the United States at the moment amongst many people. On the other side of that coin, it's become a bit of an exporter of sort of anti-woke populism. And so you'll see, people, and not least in our country, but in other countries, talking with approval about what Trump is doing. Oh, he's sorting them out. We're getting, dealing with all this political correct nonsense and all sort of stuff. So in a sense, I suppose that's a form of soft power. I think one of the biggest areas, it strikes me, first of all, that many less people are traveling to the United States now.
Mm.
And secondly, I think the United States under Trump has misunderstood the realities of living in an interconnected world in the 21st century. He feels that he can not only re-engineer the world economy to suit America's national interests, as he interprets them, but also he can have his cake and eat it on the soft power front. And I think that's not happening. I think, in a sense, China has been delighted with the second Trump administration. And in fact, it may even be emboldening China in relation to Taiwan, unfortunately. And also his inability to stand up to Mr. Putin has certainly been noted in Beijing. And it's the irony is that, Mr. Trump wants to, if he wants to give the impression that he's a strong person, but he's been incredibly weak with both Netanyahu and Putin. So it is an odd mixture, but I do agree that, America has taken a soft power hit, and it may well, I think what we're witnessing in the post 9/11 period is the gradual decline of the United States, unfortunately, and that seems to be carrying on. If anything, accelerated a little bit during the second Trump administration, because we're seeing the erosion of a democracy.
Robert, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Lovely to see you again.
Good to see you.
And a big week in the world of geopolitics and New Zealand's role in it. Now it's a real pleasure to welcome in a special guest to the Hoon, Daniel McLaughlin, who is the Listener's political columnist and a long-time writer, observer, luckily not a participant, I suppose, on politics.
Despairer.
That's right. And Daniel, I really enjoy your writing because often it takes a deeper and broader view than the usual horse race coverage that we get, sometimes covering politics in New Zealand. And you have some interesting views on the issue of state capture. This week,
Yes.
I think it's particularly relevant given what's happened with the electricity reforms, in inverted commas. What did you make of all the kerfuffle, the huffing and the puffing, and then the eventual, damp squib that landed in front of us?
I guess it was, like you said, just a classic example of not the state being captured so much as just the government, the people running it, obviously sort of capitulated to the sector and just about any way they possibly could. And, even with like the supermarkets and the banks, there's kind of been a little sort of bit of a gesture that maybe things aren't quite working well and we need to, beef up the competition a little bit. But it seems like this was just a total, like cave in to give them everything that they wanted. There's no kind of consequences for imposing, like quite catastrophic economic loss on the small and medium business sector, on the rest of the country, on households. They just get everything they want.
Yeah, because there was an opportunity here for the government, which likes to talk up its ability to, control the costs of living, to grow the economy, when it's clear that electricity bills up nearly 20% in the last 2 years. They've grown faster than the rest of inflation for the last, 25, 30 years. And as we've seen last winter and again this winter, thousands of job losses in manufacturing and apparent deindustrialization, and an enormous amount of pressure from both big and small business on the government to allow a much more competitive market. So there was an opportunity here for the government to do the traditional centre-right thing of encouraging competition markets, letting business flower, as well as, being tough on monopolization of prices and doing its bit to achieve lower inflation, which is one of the reasons it got elected. So it isn't a curious thing of where they talk a good game, but then when it comes to it, it doesn't happen.
And I think, Simon Bridges, a former National Party leader and energy minister, has been quite critical. He's certainly not the only person within the party that thinks this could end badly for us. This could have quite catastrophic political consequences. It seems kind of obvious that, if there's a winter energy crisis next year, which is something that they've done nothing to sort of, protect themselves against, then that will just be disastrous for them. But it's been covered in the media a little bit that the Prime Minister's office has a chief of staff who is a former head of the Electricity Retailers Association. The Prime Minister himself seems to sort of have this very confident. He's a very self-confident guy. Seems very sure that the market works. That they've sort of got the settings about right. It needs to be tweaked a little bit maybe, but that was sort of. The conversation couldn't really go anywhere internal to the government. It was there was nothing to fix from the sort of perspective of the people running things.
Because talking of potential splits in the government, or at least in their views, you've got David Seymour, who, despite being a self-professed libertarian, actually seems very keen on protecting the property rights of monopolies. In various ways, not wanting to use regulation to structurally separate the gentailers in the same way that telecom was broken up. And then also you've got Nicola Willis has been talking quite strongly for a year or so now about the problem we have is a not very competitive market, and here's an opportunity to get inflation down, not just on electricity, but also on supermarkets. She's talked a good game there and then bailed out at the end. And also the whole butter thing, where she went into a meeting with the Fonterra CEO saying, I'm going to tell him what's what, and then came out saying, actually, he said that everything's fine and I agree with him, which, if anything, seemed to undermine her position with business leaders. Do you think there's the tensions within the coalition have sort of frozen them like a rabbit in the headlights?
I think so. I wrote about this, I think, near the beginning of the year. In Watership Down, the rabbits, when they're in the middle of the road and they see a car coming, they go tharn, which they're just dazzled by the headlights. And I sometimes feel like the government is going tharn. They can kind of see the oncoming, they see their death coming in the polls and they're just completely paralyzed. I think Nicola Willis has paid quite a price for kind of standing up and saying, hey, we've got real problems with these monopolies and cartels and oligopolies, and it's killing us. And that she's not the only person saying that. The OECD say that every time they do a country review. They say, what are you guys doing? Your markets are a disaster and it's, stifling your economy. But she's come under very intense attack from the Taxpayers Union, especially. For saying these things, but she hasn't been able to really deliver very much either. So it hasn't been a successful mission for her. It's gone badly every way it could, I think.
Yeah, you mentioned this idea of being performative and then not delivering. But this isn't something unique to New Zealand or even to this government. We've seen a lot of it in previous governments, Labour governments. We've seen a lot of it overseas where governments which have been, very focused on delivering balanced budgets and pursuing market reforms have ended up bowing before the bond vigilantes and not delivering improved public services, not really changing this ever-growing inequality, saying they're going to do it, saying they're doing something about it, but never actually delivering it. What's going on here with this whole this performative politics and non-delivery problem?
Stagnation. So there are a couple of kind of theorists that I think are a useful way to talk about this. One of them is a bit older, and one of them was a book that was published quite recently. So there's an American economist called Mansur Olson. I think who died in the late 20th century, and he wrote about the rise and fall of nations is a kind of theory of why nations kind of become wealthy and prosperous and large and then sort of freeze up and stagnate. And his theory was that the richer a country gets, the larger the scale, the more it becomes possible for a small organized group, he calls them distributional coalitions, to form and just arrange a way to transfer little bits of, the public's money to themselves. And so that could look like, that could look like an electricity monopoly where they just kind of charge a bit more. And it's always kind of a little bit complex. That, if you look into what's actually going on with electricity, it's to do with, firming power and the sort of marginal cost of operating a coal plant. And it's quite hard for the public to understand what's really going on. And it's very easy for the industry associations that to defend him to say, actually, the market's working really well and you've got nothing to complain about. But so for Olson, these distributional coalitions, they conduct opaque transfers. And so there is just sort of a little bit of money going from everybody or nearly everybody, and it aggregates up to very large profits for the group that is able to kind of build that political coalition to arrange that. It's hard to see what's going on. And for Olson, these things aggregate up. You get more and more of them because it's such a good tactic. It's such a great way to make money. And so you start to see it in, for example, the productivity statistics. All of the country's wealth is going to these distributional coalitions instead of generating jobs, growing new firms, generating businesses, developing export markets. The distributional coalitions just capture more and more. And it's quite hard to point to any one thing and say that's what's gone wrong, because it's 1,000 of these coalitions, and they can always make a very strong case for themselves. And the way they've arranged things is kind of complicated. We had the supermarkets using the land covenants to keep new supermarkets out. Again, that's kind of hard to see, and it's kind of hard to explain to the public that the real problem is a supermarket that doesn't exist because of this obscure legal tactic. So that's one way that I think is a really useful way to think about what's going wrong with kind of advanced Western democracies. So does that resonate with you?
Yes, and I'm curious about the other one.
So the other one was a book that was published at the start of this year, Abundance, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, who are American political commentators. And they were kind of looking at places like California and New York and asking themselves, what has gone wrong with the politics of these places? They are, controlled by the Democratic Party, the blue states. And in theory, the sort of theory of left-wing politics is that the right is, the problem with everything. Populism, neoliberalism, austerity. So Klein and Thompson want to say, well, what's gone wrong in these places where there really functionally is no right? And again, his argument is that, and it sort of ties into Olson's, that there is just an abundance of regulation that causes scarcity. And it can be, property zoning laws to prevent intensification is one that they talk about a lot. And that's really beneficial for property owners. It means that as the population's going up and the number of, more houses aren't being built because nobody can get consent to build a house or it's very expensive, it just elevates property prices. That makes politicians very popular. But again, that sort of shifts all of these costs onto the people that can't afford to buy housing, and you start to get a larger homeless population, you start to get poorly maintained houses. So again, it's a different kind of distributional coalition, and it's one that people on the left find very hard to see because it's caused by regulation. And on the left, like, regulation's a good thing. It's how we get good things. So it's a very persuasive argument as well, I think, for one of the things that's going on.
Just finally, we've sort of been here before. I think of the Gilded Age in the United States, where the robber barons, the railway trusts, essentially controlled huge chunks of the US economy. But then there was a reaction. William Randolph Hearst and all of his papers, and Ida Tarbell and Teddy Roosevelt and all of that stuff came back. And then, of course, in the First and Second World Wars, we saw a point where, America really delivered a bunch of stuff and improved the lives of most people, as opposed to just those at the top. And so there is a chance for a recovery, right?
I mean, I would say two things about that. One is that it's a really important part of Olson's theory, is that wars and other events like that are a really good way to disrupt the coalitions, because the stakes of the economy working well become very high. And if nothing can get built and nobody can do anything, then that is going to work out badly for everybody. So, obviously there's still some degree of war profiteering, but generally speaking, there's often a reform movement when there is a moment of crisis. Um, and that period that you talked about, the sort of, the post-robber baron era in the 19th century, the progressive era, the sort of, it's an interesting time to go back and look at. My favorite book about politics is The Power Broker by Rob Caro, which
Oh,
is
yeah.
this massive sweeping study of politics in New York in the 20th century. And so the progressive era is really about politicians saying, they don't use this language, but they're saying antitrust, monopolies are bad. We have to break up these monopolies. We have to get competitive markets. We have to, have lower prices so that people can have more power, more housing, more public transport. And it's also about breaking up the kind of it's about improving the performance of the public sector, which in the US and the power broker story, it's completely controlled by the Democratic Party machine. It's just a way to generate jobs for people that donate money to the Democratic Party or get out the votes. And so the progressive era is saying, no, this is supposed to be for the people. It's supposed to be delivering schools and healthcare and that kind of thing. And I often think of the sort of enormous explosive growth of the consultants and the contractors under the last government. And that felt very similar to what was happening and what they were talking about. This idea that delivering these services just becomes an excuse to give money to the government's friends. So again, that's looking at problems that are caused on the left and the right.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Lovely to have you on the show to talk about these things. We'd love to talk again. And unless, of course, the economy breaks free of being captured before then, but I've got a feeling it's not going
And
to.
we'll have nothing to talk about. It'll be a good problem to have. Thanks, Bernard.
Thank you very much.
Okay, see ya.
Thanks.
Bye.
It's time now to welcome Mike Casey into the show, the CEO of Rewiring Aotearoa. Lovely to see you, Mike. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us late on a Thursday evening when you've probably got some family things on. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
Kia ora, Bernard. It's always great to be on. You know what? I wouldn't interrupt school holidays for anyone but you.
Oh,
so,
thank you very
great
much.
to be here.
Yeah, well, this week has been a big one, a school holidays week, but it's when the government announced some massive, well, apparently massive changes to the electricity market. What did you make of the package of reforms, which were presented as sweeping and transformative?
Sweeping and transformative, definitely the way it was presented. I think in reality, not very sweeping or transformative at all is probably the way that I would summarize that. There's a lot of talk about the energy sector and how it's lost a lot of social license. It's costing New Zealanders a lot more money than it used to. A lot of talk from the government about how they're addressing this, but we didn't really see a lot within the announcements that actually looked like it was going to lower costs for New Zealanders. It seemed to do a bit to increase the share price of the gentailers and seem to do a lot to prop up the fossil fuel industry in New Zealand. And if that's anything to go by, it looks like the wealth shift is going to continue to move from the small end of town to the big end of town. And I think, we've got to really examine and push back on some of these things and make sure that we get the energy system that New Zealanders truly deserve.
Yeah, because there's actually an opportunity here in front of small businesses and large businesses to take advantage of an historic fall in the cost of solar panels, batteries, to do what countries like Pakistan, Uruguay have done, which is to, shift away from fossil fuels to cheaper renewable
Totally. And I think
generated.
that there's a lot of conflating of two big problems that are going on in the energy sector at the moment. One, power prices for everyday New Zealanders, our households, our whānau, continue to go up. And that's something that we have to address. New Zealand has this very unique energy security issue called a dry year, which is when it doesn't rain a lot and our lakes get really low and our hydro scheme gets under stress. And that is also a problem that needs to be solved. But they've been conflated together in these announcements. And in reality, when we're looking at lowering bills for New Zealanders, well, there is only probably, I think, one way to guarantee that happens at the moment, and that is to put solar panels on their rooftops. And even if you finance solar on a rooftop at, 5.5%, a pretty standard interest rate, and you're looking at about $1,000 of savings once you have taken out from, I guess, the gross savings, the payback of the capital and the interest on that finance. So that's $1,000 a year for households in New Zealand, which is just remarkable. And there was the rumor mill was, going around a lot in the energy circles that the government was going to do something around solar, and I was getting all excited. And of course, the Frontier report came out, and the government's response to the Frontier report came out. And yeah, that excitement evaporated very quickly, unfortunately, Bernard. So we've got a little bit of work to do still to make sure that we fight for the customers. Yeah.
Yeah. So what could they have done to really make a difference? Let's say they got a blank slate. They give you the Frontier report and say, "What do you reckon, Mike? What should we do?" Which will get us
Energy
re-elected.
minister for a day. Yeah, if I was energy minister for a day. So the first thing that I think is super important is making sure that we have a narrative set that solar is going to play a massive role in the future energy system of New Zealand. We know that that's likely to happen because it is the cheapest energy New Zealanders are ever going to get, but there's a lot of barriers standing in the way at the moment. The biggest barrier, of course, is the upfront capital costs. It's probably about $20,000 to put solar on your rooftop. When you spend that $20,000, you're locking in a really low price of power, probably 13 cents a kilowatt hour on your roof for the next 25 years. But $20,000 is still a lot of money, and a lot of Kiwis have an allergic reaction to putting extra debt or taking out extra debt. But one of the things New Zealanders must also understand is that, well, you're kind of paying energy landlords in perpetuity. You're paying a gentailer, you're paying a gas company, you're paying a petrol company every week or every month or whatever it might be. So you kind of already have those outgoings. And so that's one big thing that I think we need to flip. And so it's how do we get all New Zealanders access to suitable finance, long-term, low-interest finance, so that they can go and finance this stuff onto their rooftops. I was kind of hoping that something in that space might come out. I've still hold out a lot of hope that this government may implement the Ratepayers Assistance Scheme, which is kind of doing this financing, low-interest financing through councils, which I think would be really, super beneficial. So that's probably the first thing. The second thing is we look overseas to Australia and we see what's happening. They're installing 1,000 batteries a day at the moment in homes with their battery subsidy. The energy system and market is not set up at the moment to recognise the value of batteries in New Zealand. So you either fix the market or you subsidise the capital cost to make it attractive for New Zealanders. And that brings down the price of power for everyone because we need less infrastructure, all of that kind of thing. But I didn't see much in the way of fixing the market at all in these recent announcements, and so that's something I'd like to happen. Yeah,
because there is an opportunity here to, have more battery farms like the one at Ruakaka and spread throughout the country, which can, take the electricity cheap in the middle of the night and then sell it when there's a spike, when everyone has their cups of tea in the morning, and use the ultimate batteries we have, which are these huge lakes, which at the moment have been given over to profit-seeking companies who, not surprisingly, marshal that water to sell it at the highest price and not to be there during the middle of winter if there is a dry winter.
Correct, and I think we've done a lot of research into a large rollout of solar across farms and across homes and what that would actually do to the hydro lakes. And what we really, I think, where solar really plays a major role in our energy security, it's not really about how much we can generate during the winter. That's a little bit to do with it, but it's how full those lakes are in autumn when we go into a dry year. That's super important. And we did a lot of research that sort of worked out that if 80% of the homes in New Zealand had rooftop solar, which is completely achievable because that's exactly what the Australians think they're going to achieve by 2050, it would buy us about 29 more days worth of water in our hydro lakes. If all the farmers did what I did on my farm, and I've got a reasonably large solar array on my farm, we're looking at another 30 days worth of water storage. So between the farms and the homes alone, they can go a long way to helping out with that. And what we saw with the most recent government announcement is kind of disregarding that aspect of it and just being like, we're going to build, billions of dollars worth of LNG terminals and, expose the New Zealand public to volatile commodity prices again when it comes to energy. We do it with petrol and diesel, about to do it with LNG as well, which is probably, I think, only going to drive the cost of power up further. So, yeah, there's a lot of sort of unpicking of the decisions that have been made here and why they have been made, but looking at the energy security opportunities with everything from diesel peakers through to the new coal deal that the Gentile has signed, through to the role that solar can play, through to the role, like as you said, with large battery scale, utility scale batteries as well, whether that LNG is actually required. And I keep looking at it and going, you know what? I'm really puzzled as to how this has ended up being a decision, especially since the report itself that these decisions are based off actually came out and said, nah, it's not a good idea economically for the people of New Zealand. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out.
Just finally, there's going to be an election in a year. And this is obviously a hot political topic. Apart from anything else, everyone pays a power bill. There are businesses closing because the power bills are too high. There are people turning off their heaters in the middle of a bloody cold winter because the power bills are too high. Probably 15% of the population is basically in energy poverty as well as food poverty. What could political parties of whatever colour, because there's a good argument that if you were a pro-business party, you'd have a policy which encouraged more renewable, cheap electricity to be generated. So what could a political party, what policies have you got for them in your smorgasbord that they could pick up and use?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot. We wrote a policy manifesto a little while ago, and we've been speaking to pretty much all of the political parties now about the different opportunities that they could pick up on. I think the biggest one to this, at the moment is still access to low interest long-term finance for people like renters and people like pensioners and people that can't get it on their mortgage necessarily, to be able to take advantage of this. I sort of see like we almost need to jump sideways out of the electricity market and get people energy into their fridges and their freezers and their hot water cylinders and their cars in a really different way, if we're not going to be brave enough to actually address the problems of the energy sector and the energy market. So that's probably where, I think the crux of it lies. I think there's going to be some smart politicians in this 2026 election. I wouldn't be surprised if this election ends up being the electric election. Say that 10 times fast, you'll probably muddle it up. But yeah, I think like that is probably where it's going to land. And what I'm hoping for the sake of everyone in New Zealand at the moment is that this is not an election where one side of politics goes, oh, I'm going to, really back the electric future, and the other side of politics therefore digs their heels in and opposes it. What we actually need is for all of them to come out and realize that we're just leaving money on the table at the moment. $55 million a day New Zealanders spend on fossil fuels. Most of that is foreign sourced, and it's about to become more than that because we're about to start importing LNG. So I think there's a big opportunity there. I think, what we've seen come out from the Labour Party so far around this stuff sort of is, immediately questioning some of the validity of it. And I think that's going to do them quite well. It'll be interesting to see what New Zealand First does, because you, like many, would have noted that Shane Jones wasn't really a part of those announcements around the energy and about the energy sector. And he's been calling for nationalisation and all sorts of things. So I think it's going to be a really hot electric election. And to be honest, I can't wait. It's going to be great.
Mike Casey, the CEO of Rewiring Aotearoa, thank you very much for coming on to the Hoon.
Thank you.
Ka kite anō, everyone. Have a great week. We'll see you all again in a week's time.